Hello, everyone. My name is Joseph Carson from Psychotic Centrify. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm really excited to share with you a real-world ransomware security incident. And I think it's really important that all organizations really get to see what happens during an attack, the techniques that attackers use, and I think it's the best way for you to get knowledge and visibility into what you can do to reduce the risks. So again, Joseph Carson here from Psychotic. I'm the Chief Security Scientist and Advisory CISO based in Tallinn, Estonia. And the next 30 minutes are going to be hopefully very educational and exciting. So let's go ahead and get started. And I have a lot to cover during this session. So the first thing is this is based on a real world ransomware case. And for me, I think it's one of the most devastating, catastrophic incidents that any company can become the victim of. So it's really important that you have the knowledge and skills in order how you respond and how you respond efficiently in order to get back to recovery, get back to operations, and what techniques you can do in order to make sure you become more resilient in the future to reduce the possibility of you becoming a victim. So this particular ransomware case is all about CRYLOC. CRYLOC is the version 2 of Cryakle. So it's really sophisticated, much more advanced, and has reduced and removed a lot of the weaknesses in previous versions. So if you do become a victim, this is typically what you're going to be faced on your endpoints, on your servers, on your applications and systems. You will basically see this screen, and this is where basically the attackers have gained access. They've got privileged access to the environment and have now deployed ransomware across your infrastructure, really bringing the business to a complete standstill. Once this happens, your business cannot continue to operate. You have to get into incident response mode. And for me, I've been involved in numerous incident response cases. I get brought in as an expert on occasion to provide my knowledge in order to help organizations recover and make sure that we understand, one, is how did the attackers gain access? How long did they have access for? And what things we need to be doing to get back to operations. So that's my specialty and skills, and I come in to help organizations. And when this happens, you want to make sure that you have access to experts to really help you get back and recover as efficient as possible. But when this does happen, you're going to be asking yourselves a lot of questions. What did the attackers have access to? And how did they do it? How did they gain access to your environment? You're going to be asking, did they have access to the domain administrator accounts? Did they have access to your domain controllers? What systems in your environment did they have access to? What about the data? Were they able to extract and steal data? What applications did they potentially have access to? Was this limited to your on-premise traditional environment? Or did the attackers also gain access to cloud? And we have to look back at the latest Verizon Data Breach Investigations report, where really attackers in the past year have really accelerated cloud attacks, where cloud assets has now overtaken on-premise assets as the top target. So something you have to be aware of, that attacks don't just get limited to certain locations, that they are now going to cross multi-hybrid cloud environments. So you have to be prepared. How long did the attackers have access for? Are you dealing with one attacker or multiple attackers? A lot of times in the specific ransomware case that I'm sharing with you today, a lot of the attackers, is that there was attackers who specialize in the access. There was two, the attackers who specialize in creating the actually ransomware CRYPTOR itself. And then there's the third ransomware group that actually deployed and gained access and used those tools. So sometimes you might be dealing with multiple attackers, and actually ransomware today is mostly part of an affiliate program where basically attackers are doing ransomware as a service. You also want to understand what tools and techniques did they use. Did they live off the land? Did they use their own tools? Did they introduce new tools in the environment in order to carry out malicious activity? And a lot of cases, they also leave backdoors behind. They disable security. They enable hidden accounts. They make configuration security changes so they can return anytime they want to. And you want to make sure that you actually uncover and actually remove those quickly and where possible. Also, what data did they take and how did they get it out of the organization? And then what is the timeline of events? How did things occur? And also, in a lot of cases, this is probably the most difficult part, is what evidence is remaining. When you're dealing with ransomware, ransomware is very destructive. It deletes the logs. It removes any footprints that you can actually leverage. And also, a lot of time, the attackers will hide the footprints that they created, deleting the log files and removing any evidence. So it's really, really difficult and very challenging. So it's really important that you do have an incident response plan. And not only is it about having an incident response plan, but it's also being incident response ready. There's a difference, about one is having a plan and having to know what procedures and processes that you need to follow, but two is also to practice it, to be prepared, to do fire drills, to do ransomware incident response drills, to actually practice and be ready, be fresh and be prepared, be incident response ready, not just have a plan. So it's really important you actually be prepared, make sure that you're actually able to be resilient and do this efficiently as possible. So here's an example of an incident response checklist that I follow, is making sure that one is that you have defined owners. How will you communicate? Your communication, traditional ways, email may not be available. You might be having a voice-operated phone lines that might not be available. So make sure you have actually clear defined alternative communications as well. Also a contact list, who you need to contact. You might need to contact law enforcement. You might need to contact legal advice, PR to help you with brand damage. So a lot of these need to be prepared beforehand. And also today, previously, ransomware, focused around the integrity and availability of cyber attacks, but it's also now getting into confidentiality, where they're not only actually disabling and encrypting the data, but they're also stealing it prior to that. So also threatening to disclose that information publicly if the ransom is not paid. So it's now actually really, crossing all of the CIA triad: confidentiality, integrity, and availability. You also want to understand your in-house capabilities. You want to make sure that you're ready to contain and gather evidence and have consistency. Important things around what time zone you're going to be using, how that evidence is going to be collected. You're going to be doing file, you're going to be doing full disk images, where that's going to be stored, who's going to be shared with. You want to be preparing a press statement, getting a legal assessment, how you can actually eradicate and make sure that you're able to clean machines and get those machines back to operations, and which areas of the business need to be done first. What's the priority? Getting into that recovery phase, and then ultimately getting into lessons learned. All of this needs to happen really fast, extremely within hours, as quickly as possible when you do become a victim. And as I mentioned, it's not about if, it's about when. And it's important that you actually have the readiness to recover quickly. And when you do become, or if you do become, you typically have three choices to recover. Either you restore from a secure, valid, good backup. Some decide to pay the ransom, which I don't recommend. That's an option. And then others hope to rebuild from what they have. This particular incident, this organization that I'm sharing you the details with today, they actually they did have a backup that they recovered from, but it was a year old. So everything in the past year that was lost in this attack, they actually had to rebuild it from things like paper, from recovered data, from scraping, scalpel techniques in order to recover certain data in order to rebuild that back. But they'd lost a year's worth of digital data. And basically that process, it took about 2 months to recover and get back to a state which was actually a good state to move on. But it kind of shows you that sometimes it might be a combination between restoring from backups and also rebuilding as well. But ultimately, you'll have a decision. Will you shut down the systems? In the particular incident that I'm referring to is that when I came in, it was about 2 hours after the ransomware was deployed. And ultimately, at that point in time, the attackers still had access. They were still actively on the systems. So we had to make a really, really harsh decision to pull the plug. And that meant not shutting the systems down, we actually disabled internet access, severed the access the attackers were actually using to gain access. And then ultimately then finding out what systems were still operational. Could they go back to manual operations in certain parts of the business? So it's really important to understand that, if you still have an active attack, how are you going to stop it? And then start that, containment phase, start the evidence gathering phase. So it's really important. The next step in incident response, especially for ransomware, is finding a copy of the CRYPTOR. And it's typically going to be found in temporary folders. It might be somewhere on the C drive. It might be somewhere in downloaded internet files, depending on how the attackers gain access. You will typically mostly find most CRYPTORs in the temporary folder or app data folder of a user location. And ultimately, finding that CRYPTOR is important to understand what you're dealing with. And when you do get a copy of the CRYPTOR, what I tend to do is I upload it to things like Joe's Sandbox, which allows me to analyze and understand, am I dealing with something that's going to self-lateral move? If I remove it, will it actually, reinstall it back again? Am I dealing with something that has a command and control? Is it leaking data out? Is it creating backdoors? Using Joe's Sandbox will give you a really good understanding about what capabilities that ransomware has, and then giving you a good understanding about what your next step will be in order to remove it. And also you're going to upload it to things like VirusTotal to ultimately find out about basically if it's known, is it has a reputation. In the particular Krylock version that I was dealing with, it actually only had about 2 or 3 of antivirus and anti-malware detected it. It was so new that basically, even if you had an up-to-date antivirus running in your systems, this would have not prevented these attacks. So it goes to show that a lot of these variants are getting updated, and they're doing basically evasion techniques so that antivirus will not stop them. So it's really important to understand what you're dealing with and some of those techniques. And then ultimately, what I look for is then following the attacker's footprints. I want to find out how they get in, what techniques they used, what evidence is remaining, and to make sure that you shut the door, to make sure that the door is closed and the attackers don't return later and cause more damage. So I'm going to share with you some of the techniques that was discovered during this particular incident. And I'm going to move over to my demo machine here. So let's go ahead and log in. And hopefully this will be educational and give you some good techniques and understanding. So the first thing is that the attackers gained access. This organization, what they've done was that enabled RDP access, like many organizations have done in the past year, to make sure their employees can work remotely. This particular incident, a particular server was enabled with RDP access to enable an accountant to access the financial information remotely. And many organizations have done this in the past year to make sure that organizations are still operational, still employees are being productive. But ultimately, if you do it without actually having security as a priority or reducing the risk, it exposes your organizations to great risk, great basically where attackers can abuse that and gain access. So I'm going to show you one technique. There's many techniques that attackers can use, such as phishing, cross-site scripting, attachments in emails, stealing credentials, credential harvesting. In this particular one, I'm going to show you is a brute force attack against remote desktop. So I'm going to be using crowbar in this case, and the -B is saying I want to brute force against RDP. And then this is the target machine, and this is the machine that was discovered on the internet. And I've already done reconnaissance, so I have a good idea of who the user of this machine is. But right now, I don't know their password. So I'm going to basically pass a password list, which is a word list, to try and see if I can find and brute force that password. And then I give it the number of threads, which is 1 in this case. So attackers will basically, when they find an RDP service publicly facing the internet, you can use tools like SHUTDOWN to discover those. They're ultimately going to be attackers who specialize in just gaining access. And then they will sell that access onto other criminals. So let's go ahead and run this. It only takes a few minutes in order to go and find a machine. And ultimately now you can see that successfully RDP access, I've been able to brute force this user on this IP and this port, and ultimately finding the password, which is basically a weak credential, something that human created, that they've chosen a password that is easy to remember, but also easy to brute force, giving the attackers access to this system. So the next thing attacker will do is basically go and abuse that. They will actually log into the system, and we can go ahead and do that through RDP, just like the accountant would have done. In this case, it's a malicious attacker who's now gaining access to this target system. So once the attacker gains access, they're going to basically log in with those stolen credentials. Now they've gained access to this machine. So one of the first things we'll do, basically, oops, log back in again, is they're going to be looking for other passwords that the user might have actually put in places which are very common or very easy to find. So let's go ahead and log back in. I want to maximize that. So and shut that one down. So one of the first things attackers will do is basically search through the desktop. And employees, they look for the easy path. If they have lots of accounts and lots of credentials to remember, what they're going to be basically doing is storing them in the desktop. And you can typically find here, and very commonly in the actually ransomware case that I dealt with, that actually the employee actually had stored credentials in a clear text file on the desktop. So easier for the attacker to see and easier for them to actually leverage and then elevate their privileges locally. Another common mistake that employees do is they'll store them in the browser. And if we actually open up the browser here, we'll see that simply by going over and clicking on passwords with no additional security, by default, password managers or password stores in the browser do not have additional security by default. And they want your passwords. They want you to store them in there. They keep prompting, store it here, store it here. But ultimately what it means is that when the employee stores it in those locations, it's easy for the attacker to go and reveal those and gain access. And then in this case, it's now gained access to their email account, might be their personal email account, might be server applications, it might be cloud applications or SaaS applications that the organization is using. Here I've also got the Expensify accounts and so forth. So here you can see that the attackers, now they've gained access to the system, they can now go and discover other accounts and other credentials that might give them access further into the organization, into more sensitive data. So another bad habit the employees are doing that we need to make sure that we reduce the risk and really do get into using a secure password manager and privileged access security rather than actually storing them in clear text and making it too easy for the attackers to be successful. So the next stage, once the attackers have really discovered and moved around and looked and tried to find other credentials, what they're going to be doing is looking how they can actually elevate and move around. Ultimately, the goal is they want to gain access to the domain account and then use that domain account to cause as much damage as possible. One is to gain access to sensitive data, and the second thing is then to actually deploy the ransomware into as many systems as possible to really bring that business to a standstill, so that the organization has no other option but potentially to pay that ransom. So let's go ahead and first of all, we're going to look and see what credentials we were able to gain access to. In this case, it's net local group. We can see actually this employee is actually a local administrator on this system. And that means that we can do a lot of malicious activities. So one of the things that the attackers will then do is they'll go ahead and download some of the malicious tools. So here I've actually gone ahead and done that prior. So one thing is I log into my auto directory. And in my auto directory here, what I'll have is a few different scripts. So before I download the tools, one thing what I'll do is, because I'm a local administrator, I've actually disabled the security. And this is one thing they'll be able to do is basically by simply running this script as a local administrator, it will turn off Defender, it will turn off the firewalls, it will disable the security in the system. Another tool that attackers have been commonly using in the past year is things like GMER. GMER is basically for looking for rootkits, but attackers are also using that to disable security as well. So sometimes things are used for good, but also can be used for malicious purposes. The next thing I'll do is, again, go on and search for passwords in configuration files in the registry. And then I'll go and actually add a new user to the system so I can return whenever I want to. I will open up RDP and also then enable sticky keys. This is where a backdoor, which allows me basically, even if the user changes the password that I've used to brute force, that they will be able to modify that, the sticky keys, and come back and actually create their own user whenever they want to. And of course, I've got other things then to download my tools and then clean up my tracks. So this is what attackers will tend to be doing, is they want to make sure that they're modifying the security of the system, especially as a local administrator. And this is where really organizations need to get in control of local administrators and actually lock them down and make sure that only authorized and only approved processes, whenever local administrators need to be used, that you do it on demand, real time, elevating when you need to, not just having persistent local administrator access all the time, in which this organization had. The next stage, what I'll end up doing is, after basically doing those configuration changes and actually disabling the security, is now I'll download some malicious tools. In this case, I'll download things like Mimikatz, and I'll use Mimikatz to go and change the registry setting. Ever since Windows 2012 Service Pack, I think it was 1 or 2, that they had actually changed this in order that, so by default, this is actually set to 0, meaning that passwords were not kept in clear text in memory. And by simply enabling this and then waiting for a domain administrator to log into the system, this is basically where the attacker will then change that configuration, leave for a few days, force where you have backup jobs, you'll have administration tasks, you'll have administrators and domain accounts logging into systems to check things that are working. Maybe they even log in to fix things. Maybe it's the help desk worker who needs to troubleshoot an issue in this system. Ultimately, by logging in with that domain account and not rotating it afterwards, will expose the actually domain accounts to further attacks from the criminals. In this case, I'll basically go and open up the log file here, take a look and see, and you see basically the attackers actually run this numerous times. They've run it a few times, so they've run it, didn't find any domain accounts, cleaned up their tracks, left, came back a day or two later to see if the domain administrators logged in again. Maybe they haven't. Left again, came back a few days later, and then ultimately, at some point in time, they'll wait for that one time, basically where the administrator logs in, and now they've actually successfully been able to gain access from a local administrator account up to a full domain administrator account, meaning now they actually own the environment. Once that happens, the attacker can now basically carry out other malicious activities. So what they can do now is they go and use tools maybe such as NetScanner. And NetScanner will then do discovery and find out all the systems in the environment. And we sometimes make it too easy for them by naming things like SQL Server and backup server and database server and ERP and CRM. And, we name servers in order to make it easy for us to see, but also the attackers will have visibility into what that service is running. They'll also be able to look at what ports are running, what applications are running, and then be able to determine the activities that they can run. In this case, I'm running a scan on this environment. And once the scan runs, I can then choose the machines, right click, and then actually run some automation. And this automation will use things like PSExec in order to laterally move, to move my malicious payloads to those systems, to turn off security remotely, to open up and create users, to download packages and so forth. So I'm using this to basically as a lateral move and also to stage that machine prior to going and accessing it. So once that happens, I can then go and log in once I've done that automation. So here, we've already basically elevated our privileges. We find the domain administrator account password in clear text after administrator logging in and not changing it. I can log into the domain controller. And what I can now do is go and then check and see if my scripts have run. And here I can see that my malicious user has been automatically created by doing that lateral move. And the malicious payloads have been downloaded here, preparing this environment for me to use these staging machines to now steal data and then deploy the malicious ransomware. So this is really the attack techniques that attackers will go through and gain access. And just to show you, after running that sticky keys script, I can go to the login prompt here. So this is one of the machines in the environment. And by simply basically, if the user ever changes the password, I can simply go to the util helper here, click here, and now have a full access to the system. And then go and add net user and add a local administrator user and regain access to the system anytime I want. And these are the techniques that attackers will use specifically in a ransomware case. So just moving back to my slides here, it's really important that you find those staging systems. You find patient zero. That will make sure that you know how they get in, how you can actually disable that access, shut the door, and actually remove any persistence or any threats that they've actually left behind, any backdoors that might be hidden in the environment. So it's really important to find that patient zero and make sure you actually get the attackers out and disable their access. As I mentioned, it's also important to understand about how did they disable security? Did you give them easy access to the local administrator account? Do your employees have local administrator access? Is that something that you can actually limit and restrict and reduce, moving to things like application control, which can make sure that employees can still run applications that require administrator access, but without needing to be a local administrator themselves, moving to real-time privilege elevation, which is really critical here. So understanding how they disable security, how they bypass your existing security controls, and ultimately, how did they elevate their privileges? Also, understanding about what persistence of backdoors are left behind. As I mentioned here, leveraging backdoors such as sticky keys, which has been around since I think around 2008, but is still being used and is still a vulnerability that we need to make sure that we look for, we search for, we look for these registry keys. We be proactive, we do threat hunting. We try to determine, is there something suspicious happening in the environment? Knowing that beforehand will reduce the likeliness of you becoming a victim. The next area is really then looking, how did they elevate privileges? Do you log into systems with domain administrator credentials? Do you log in and actually use those, and then do you rotate the passwords or not? Do you make it difficult, or do you make it easy for the attackers to gain access to domain accounts? Limiting the usage, making sure you're logging in and elevating on demand, making sure that you're automatically rotating those passwords after usage will make it more difficult. Our job is to make sure that we force the attackers to take more risk. The more risks that they take, the more challenging it is for them to be successful. The more noise they will create in your environment. And the more noise they create, the more chance you have of discovering them before it becomes too late. You can actually get into being proactive and actually reducing the ability for them to deploy ransomware successfully, limiting where they can actually deploy it successfully, and getting more control, reducing that risk in environment. So our job is to make sure we force the attackers to take that risk, because that's where we actually have an advantage. That's where we have a chance. So understanding things like where they're actually leveraging, elevating the privileges, being able to run Mimikatz in order to gain access to clear text passwords. Again, searching for these registry keys, doing a discovery in the environment to find out maybe have they been changed, have they been modified, where do they exist, and getting visibility and transparency over those. And again, how do they lateral move? Do you allow PSExec to be run without any limitations? Especially in this particular victim, it was been run 8 p.m. on a Saturday night, 7 a.m. on a Sunday morning. Knowing when things should be run within the time frame, within the time limits, is so critical. So make sure that you actually understand the behavior. Do you allow applications to run anytime in the environment, or do you want to actually, have approval processes? Do you want to have restrictions? Do you want to have transparency? Do you want to have monitoring in place? Do you want them to be using specific credentials? So making sure that these tools, which are being many cases used for good, but in a lot of the cases, they can also be used for malicious. And it's important that you actually have that visibility, have good auditing, use solutions that have the ability to detect application elevation, application discovery, where administrative credentials have been run and used, will give you better visibility into how to reduce the risks. And then ultimately understanding about how automation's been used. Are they going to be using your own tools or introducing other tools that might be malicious? So basically, these tools, again, can be used for good, but again, can be used for bad. So it's really important to understand and discover, doing asset discovery in an environment to find out what is out there, what actually executables and applications are on systems, and then determining what elevation or what privileges they need, getting in that discovery. So what things can you do to reduce the risk even further? How do we actually get it to making it more difficult for attackers to be successful? So here's some of my top tips. Hopefully that will be helping you in order to actually become more resilient and reduce the risk of you becoming a victim. Is good cybersecurity, hygiene, and education. Help employees be successful. Reward your employees with a password manager. Making sure you have a solid backup plan and a tested backup plan, because that's the way to recover if you do become a victim of ransomware. Practice the principle of least privilege. Don't use your domain administrator accounts easily anywhere without rotating passwords or doing elevation on demand. The principle of least privilege is your path to zero trust strategy. Privilege account management, making sure that you're able to rotate credentials, you're able to audit credentials, and understand about how you can reduce the local administrator needs in your environment. Practice application control. Make sure that only trusted applications are allowed to run when people have identified and verified their identity, that they're only allowed to run at certain times, that you have to have approval processes to do so. And again, maintain patching and up-to-date your security posture. These are some of my top tips to help you get on the path to becoming more resilient and basically, making it more difficult, forcing attackers to take more risks. To help you, we've created an instant response template that you can download, apply to your organization, and help you be ready before an attack does happen in your organization. Get a solid instant response plan to get you on the path to becoming resilient, being more ability to get back to operations quickly, and making it difficult for attackers. So again, this is Joseph Carson from Psychotic Centrify. It's been a pleasure. I hope this has been educational, and please do take the advice. Do put in the right processes and right procedures in place to make it more difficult, to help you be more successful and reduce the likeliness of your organization becoming a victim. Take care and all the best, and thank you.